Hello again. Some people have been greatly reassured to be told that the oppressive regulations and laws under which we are now living in Britain will be removed as soon as the crisis is over. I can tell any mug who thinks that this is likely to happen that there is not the remotest chance of any government abandoning such useful laws which allow it to exercise power over the citizens. Why would it? It's simply not in the nature of governments to do so. I'm not talking about Britain in particular, or saying that Boris Johnson is an especially bad example of a power-hungry politician. I'm talking in a broader sense about all governments. Why do people become involved in politics and try and get to be a member of a government? There are three chief reasons. One is that it enables you to get your name and photograph in the newspapers or on the telly. If you are pompous and self-important, this is great. It can really boost your confidence. You feel like somebody. Another motive is to become well off. In addition to a generous salary and lots of expenses, there's plenty of ways for money to be made on the side if you're an MP, in all manner of different ways. Perhaps most alluring thing, though, about being a politician in government is that you get to boss folk around and tell them how to live their lives. You can tell them when they can go to the pub, what food they can eat, where they can go, how they must raise their children, all sorts of things. Often people who go into local government as councillors are busybodies of this type, who love to make rules for other people to follow. Members of the cabinet have a great time dictating to people every aspect of their lives. They can do this, of course, even when there isn't a COVID crisis, but it's a lot easier if you can claim you're dealing with the greatest threat to the country since the Second World War. How can anybody argue with your rules and laws then without looking like seditious traitors? This is when you can bring in emergency legislation, which you assure people is for their own good and will be chucked out as soon as the crisis is over. I remember two good examples of this happening in Britain. In November 1974, two bombs were planted by Irish terrorists. They exploded in the English city of Birmingham, killing a total of 21 people. 4 days later, the then Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, announced that in response to the unprecedented threat to the nation, he would bring in a new law, the Prevention of Terrorism Temporary Provisions Act. It would only remain as long as the emergency lasted and would have to be renewed every year by Parliament, a bit like the so-called sunset clauses in the current laws about COVID. In Parliament, MPs said the country faced the greatest threat since the Second World War. That's quite a good line, actually. I'm sure that viewers have heard the same gag used lately about COVID, of course. The new terrorism law that was to deal with a very limited emergency would be dropped as soon as it was safe to do so, and it was rushed through both houses of Parliament in 48 hours, a week after the Birmingham bombings. Every year it was renewed without debate by Parliament, still with the words temporary provisions tacked on the end. Then 15 years later, the words temporary provisions were dropped. It was so obviously here to stay. That temporary law is now the current Terrorism Act. A piece of rushed-in legislation almost 50 years ago that we were promised would be temporary is now a permanent law that no one needs to look at every year anymore. It's here to stay. At the time that the Prevention of Terrorism Temporary Provisions Act was passed, pubs in Britain were obliged by law to close at 10:30 in the evening on weekdays. They also had to close in the afternoon and could only reopen a few hours later after a decent interval. This was odd. Why did pubs have to close down during the afternoon? Nobody knew. It was just how things were. It's almost beyond belief that this was the result of a piece of temporary legislation passed during the First World War. Lloyd George was Minister of Munitions in 1915 and 1916 and was worried that workers were spending time in the pub and not turning up on time for their shifts. He was himself fanatical about drink, being a teetotaler. He arranged for the Defence of the Realm Act to be altered so that pubs would have to close early at night and also stay closed for a while in the afternoon. That was during the year that the Battle of the Somme took place. Just a bit of emergency legislation to deal with a temporary crisis during the First World War. This then remained the law until the 1990s, affecting everybody who wanted to drink in a pub. This is why I'm so confident that the present emergency regulations will not simply fade away, but will end up in force for the next 50 or 100 years. Governments do not give up powers which they have acquired. What would be the fun in having less power over people's lives?